On July 17, 1944, a catastrophic event unfolded at the Port Chicago Naval Magazine, a bustling munitions loading dock located near Concord, California. This incident, often overshadowed by other World War II events, remains one of the deadliest disasters on US soil during the war. At the heart of this tragedy were 320 lives lost, nearly 400 injured, and countless families forever altered by a preventable calamity rooted in systemic issues and negligence. Port Chicago was a vital hub in the US war effort, where bombs, mines and artillery shells were loaded onto ships bound for the Pacific theater. The urgency of the war effort meant that safety standards were often overlooked in favour of speed and efficiency. Adding to the precarious situation was the fact that the majority of the workforce consisted of African American sailors who had been assigned to these dangerous tasks without proper training or equipment. The conditions at Port Chicago were gruelling. Sailors worked long hours, often late into the night, under immense pressure to meet the demands of the war. The loading operations involved handling live ammunition, some of which weighed over 1,000 pounds. The sailors were not provided with any formal training on how to handle these munitions safely. Instead, they were expected to learn on the job, relying on instructions from officers who also lacked specialized expertise in ordnance management. Adding to the danger, there was a culture of competition among the crews. Officers often turned the task of loading munitions into a race, pitting teams against each other to see who could load the most tonnage in the shortest amount of time. This competitive environment not only increased the likelihood of mistakes, but also dehumanized the sailors, reducing their efforts to mere numbers on a tally sheet. The sailors had expressed concerns about the unsafe conditions multiple times. They reported hearing ominous creaks and groans from the loading equipment and observed instances of rough handling of the volatile cargo. However, their warnings were dismissed by superiors who prioritized speed over safety. The racial dynamics of the time also played a role, as the predominantly white officers often disregarded the voices of their black subordinates. On the fateful night of July 17th, two ships were docked at Port Chicago, the SS Quinault Victory and the SS E.A. Bryan. Both vessels were being loaded with nearly 5,000 tons of high explosives, including bombs, depth charges and ammunition. The operation proceeded under the same unsafe conditions that had become routine at the port. Sailors worked tirelessly, unaware that they were standing on what was essentially a powder keg. At 10:18 p.m. a massive explosion erupted, tearing through the dock with unimaginable force. The SS E.A. Bryan, already heavily loaded with ammunition, was obliterated instantly. The SS Quinault Victory, still being loaded, was blown apart moments later. The blast was so powerful that it registered as a 3.4 magnitude earthquake on seismographs and was heard as far away as San Francisco, approximately 30 miles from the site. The devastation was total. The dock and the two ships were reduced to fragments. Nearby buildings were flattened and windows shattered in towns miles away. Of the 320 people killed, most were African American sailors who had been loading the ships. The sheer scale of the destruction made identification of remains nearly impossible, and many families were left with no closure. The impact on the survivors was equally harrowing. Those who lived through the explosion described a scene of utter chaos. The air was filled with the acrid smell of burning explosives, and the cries of the injured echoed through the night. Emergency responders worked tirelessly to rescue survivors and recover bodies, but the scale of the disaster overwhelmed their efforts. In the immediate aftermath, questions arose about what had caused the explosion. Investigators determined that unsafe loading practices and the lack of proper training were likely contributors. However, the exact spark that triggered the explosion was never identified. Some speculated that it could have been caused by a dropped bomb, a spark from a piece of machinery, or even static electricity. The Navy's response to the disaster was deeply flawed. Rather than addressing the systemic issues that had led to the explosion, officials sought to deflect blame. The surviving sailors, most of whom were African American, were ordered to return to work under the same hazardous conditions just days after the disaster. When 50 sailors refused, citing fears for their safety, they were accused of mutiny. The trial of these 50 men, known as the Port Chicago 50, became a landmark case in the history of civil rights and labor relations in the military. The sailors argued that they were not mutineers, but simply men who valued their lives and refused to work in conditions they believed were a death sentence. Despite their compelling arguments, all 50 were convicted of mutiny and sentenced to prison. The Port Chicago disaster and the subsequent trial drew attention to the systemic racism and inequities within the U.S. Armed Forces. It highlighted the lack of value placed on the lives of African American servicemen and the institutional barriers they faced. Public outcry over the incident and the convictions contributed to growing pressure for change. In the years following the disaster, the Port Chicago tragedy became a catalyst for reforms. It played a role in the eventual desegregation of the U.S. military as President Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981 in 1948, mandating the integration of the armed forces. The incident also led to increased scrutiny of safety practices in munitions handling and the implementation of stricter regulations. Despite these changes, the memory of Port Chicago has faded from public consciousness. The site of the explosion is now part of the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial, a tribute to the lives lost and a reminder of the sacrifices made during wartime. Yet, the story of the disaster and its aftermath serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of negligence, discrimination, and the failure to prioritize safety. The psychological toll on survivors and their families was profound. Many of those who lived through the explosion struggled with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. They carried the memories of that night with them for the rest of their lives, haunted by the sights, sounds, and losses they endured. The Port Chicago disaster is a chapter in American history that underscores the importance of accountability, equity, and the need to learn from past mistakes. It stands as a testament to the resilience of those who fought for justice and a better future, even in the face of immense tragedy. The disaster also brought to light the limited resources available to victims' families. Many of the African American sailors' families received minimal support or compensation, which highlighted the disparity in treatment compared to their white counterparts in similar situations. This inequity sparked further outrage and fed into the broader civil rights movement. Local communities around Port Chicago bore the brunt of the disaster's impact. Entire neighborhoods mourned the loss of multiple residents, while survivors' accounts painted harrowing pictures of how quickly lives were uprooted. The surrounding area, covered in debris and contaminated by the explosion, became a stark reminder of the dangers associated with neglect. The environmental damage from the explosion also posed long-term challenges. Debris from the blast, much of it containing hazardous materials, was scattered across the region, affecting local ecosystems. Cleanup efforts took months, with many workers exposed to unsafe conditions during the process, compounding the tragedy. In later years, historians and activists revisited the Port Chicago disaster as a symbol of the unspoken sacrifices of African American servicemen during World War II. The event's relative obscurity became a point of contention, with advocates pushing for greater recognition of its significance. The legal battle following the mutiny trial also set a precedent for examining how race influenced judicial outcomes within the military. Legal scholars have noted that the convictions of the Port Chicago 50 highlighted the racial biases entrenched in the justice system of the time, sparking calls for reforms. Efforts to exonerate the Port Chicago 50 continue to this day. Advocacy groups and descendants of the sailors have repeatedly petitioned the government to clear their names, arguing that the convictions were unjust and a product of systemic racism. While some progress has been made in acknowledging their plight, full exoneration remains elusive. The incident also reshaped the narrative of World War II's home front. While much of the focus historically has been on industrial achievements and societal unity, Port Chicago's story sheds light on the overlooked struggles and inequities faced by marginalized groups contributing to the war effort. Survivors and witnesses of the disaster became unwilling spokespersons for change. Their testimonies, often laced with pain and anger, became powerful tools for advocating reforms in safety protocols and labor conditions, especially for African American workers in hazardous roles. In the decades following the explosion, the Port Chicago Naval Magazine National Memorial has served as a solemn site of remembrance. Annual ceremonies bring together descendants, historians and activists to honor the victims and reflect on the broader implications of the disaster. Education initiatives have also been launched to ensure that future generations learn about Port Chicago. Local schools incorporate the story into their curriculums, and efforts are ongoing to include it in national history textbooks as a critical moment in the intersection of wartime and civil rights history. The disaster's enduring legacy is one of both sorrow and resilience. It reminds us of the cost of systemic neglect and the importance of vigilance in preventing such tragedies. At the same time, it highlights the power of collective memory and advocacy in driving societal progress. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more stories and share your ideas for the next video in the comments.